Hey everybody, Austin here again with another Patreon or patron backer, not just Patreon, but another Q&A session. This is Q&A session number 4. So before I actually jump into this, I wanted to remind people that if you are a Patreon backer, or if you're a YouTube channel member, or if you're a Twitch subscriber and you have access to my Discord, I have a Q&A section there that patrons can basically send questions to. I add them to a list, and when I get enough questions on that list, I go ahead and I do an episode like this. If you guys want to see this more frequently, come up with questions, toss them in the Discord, or if you're on Patreon itself, send me a message there with your questions, or drop them on my Q&A posts that I do over there on Patreon. So big shout outs to Timo, the Girl Geek, and Sleeves of War, who basically gave me questions. We actually had questions from another fellow as well, but we ended up losing him, unfortunately, so we're not going to do those questions. Yeah, thanks guys for that. I'm just going to go down the questions here in order. Some of them might be repeats of previous Q&A session questions, but we're going to go ahead and do them anyway. Also, just a disclaimer, I am using a different microphone for this. My normal mic is in a different room. I'm on a different computer setup right now, but I think it'll be fine. You know, it's just a casual Q&A session. So, but all right, first up from Timu is, what is your favorite console controller? And I'm going to list a few different controllers here. I'm not sure if I've really ever talked about this before on a Q&A. You know, each controller is better for certain kinds of games than others, but for really fast-paced action games that require lots of button mashing and very tight precision inputs, you know, in games like Mega Man or some Ninja Gaiden or Contra or something like that. The NES controller is my favorite for those. It does have some sharp edges, but it's super responsive, especially if you got a new old stock controller. It's just very, very snappy, and it just, not much else feels quite like the NES controller. It's perfect for that system's games, and a lot of other, kinds of games as well, but mostly NES games. Next up is the Saturn controller, the Model 2 controller, or in Japan, the Model 1 controller, because there really was only one main primary controller in Japan. But in North America, it was our Model 2 controller. I actually like the Model 1 controller as well. It's actually pretty comfortable, but and I might actually prefer the Model 1's buttons over the Model 2's buttons, but with the shape of it and how finicky the shoulder keys are and how big that D-pad is, the Model 2 Saturn controller is definitely the way to go for that system. It's pretty much my favorite digital controller for 2D games for the mid-90s in particular. It's got the best D-pad I've ever used. It's a floating D-pad, but it's a little more, I'd say a little more accurate than the Genesis floating D-pad of the 6-button controller, and that's a fantastic controller too. But I do find myself doing diagonals by accident a little too much on the Genesis 6-button, whereas on the Saturn Model 2 controller, it's just, I never have those issues. It's just perfect for me. It's very comfortable. I can use it for very long stretches of time. The shoulder keys feel great. They got this really satisfying clicky feel to them with these micro switches on the inside. And the buttons are very, very solid as well. They have this very unique, kind of like hard plasticky feel. There's not like this really strong tactile feeling you get from it, but they're very effective. They're very responsive, and it's fairly easy to mash, and it's just a great controller all around. Last up is the Super Nintendo controller. The SNES controller is just so comfortable. It's so smooth. It's got these nice rounded edges. The shoulder keys feel great. They don't feel too cramped for me. The face buttons are fantastic as well. Really like how the bottom buttons are convex and the top buttons are concave, so I don't even really have to look at the controller, and I just know where my thumbs are based on the feel of the buttons, which is always great. Really great controller. I can use it for very long stretches of time, and it never wears on my hands or anything like that. Honorable mention goes to the Xbox One controller. Yeah, I'm going to say Xbox One controller because, the D-pad's not, fantastic on it, to be honest with you. It is serviceable, it does work, and the buttons are fine, but the big thing is the analog sticks, and I feel like I'm obligated to put at least one analog-based controller in here. And the Xbox One has the smoothest analog sticks I've ever used. Ever, pretty much. It's got the top tier analog sticks. It makes finessing on racing games, driving games, and first person shooters and third person 3D games. Very, very easy. It's very, very silky smooth. Those analogs in the Xbox One controller make it probably the best analog stick controller for me personally, so I have to throw that in there as well. So yeah, thank you Timu for that question, and on to the Girl Geeks set of questions, which is, first one is, what was your biggest gaming purchase regret? And I had to do a lot of thinking on this one. You know, I've had a lot of like minor regrets over the years, but there are a lot of things I've purchased that really weren't very good, but I didn't regret them because it was worth having the experience with them. You know, like a bunch of clone consoles by At Games and Hyperkin and guys like that. You know, they're not great, but I don't really regret them. They weren't that expensive, and I'm glad I've had the experience. Same with some more obscure consoles that just aren't that great, but I have had some consoles that were basically lemons that just gave me a lot of trouble, and despite having the experience with them, you know, the experience overall was mostly negative because of the problems that they gave me. This doesn't mean that they're not systems worth investing in, because they are good platforms. But, you know, if you pay a lot of money for something and it doesn't work half the time, that quickly goes into the regret category. So I have a handful of regrets here. So first one is the FM Towns Marty. I bought it from, you know, a fellow viewer many years ago, and it just gave me tons of problems. You know, it would stop reading discs. The thing felt like it was overheating. The guy that sold it to me offered to, you know, repair it for free as long as I bought capacitor kits for it, and I did. I sent it out to him, which cost me shipping. I had to pay for shipping back, so that was money. I had to buy the cap kit. He fixed it, quote-unquote fixed it. I get it back. It still didn't work, or at least it worked for a day, and then it crapped out again. And then it was just this nightmare. And the thing about the FM Towns Marty is there aren't replacement drive lasers for it, so, you know, if that's an issue, there was no direct replacement for it at the time. And what was really aggravating about it is he offered to buy it back off me, which that ended up working out. He says it worked perfectly fine for him, which kind of left me scratching my head. It didn't work perfectly fine for me, but it worked perfectly fine for him. And it was a really expensive purchase. You know, it was like $400. You know, the Marty was not cheap, and you know, for all the kind of the hell I had to go through with it, it just wasn't worth it. You know, I would have been better off maybe buying a different Marty, or just not even experiencing it at all, because, well, it's a really neat system. It's got good games on it. Most of the games are available elsewhere. I don't really recommend buying an FM Towns Marty, especially not for the prices they go for these days. And, you know, I wouldn't have regretted it had it not had problems, but with all the problems it had, it was just one of those experiences I probably could have done without. It was just a lot of stress, a lot of undue stress, and yeah, that was pretty frustrating. So, will I own another Marty in the future? I'm not entirely sure. It depends on how much money they cost and if I can find a boxed one and if it actually works, but I don't know. Next up is my Japanese PlayStation 2. The current Japanese PS2 I have anyway is a Japanese PS2 Slim. And, you know, this guy has been working fine over the years as far as actually reading discs, except it has this one slight problem where the ribbon on the laser comes up too high and it touches the disc while the disc is in motion. And basically what it's done is it's put these deep, massive circular scratches on a lot of my Japanese PS1 and PS2 games. It doesn't always do it, and it seems to just do it at the most inopportune times. And, you know, it's really frustrating having to deal with that, and I haven't been able to find a permanent fix online. If anybody knows if this is something that can be fixed mechanically, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to end up having to just buy another Japanese PlayStation 2, and the shame about that is they're not cheap. They're at least $100 to $150. I would want another boxed one. I wouldn't go with a Slim. I'd go with an old fat, and probably something that's a little more limited, like one of the ceramic white ones or something like I used to have. And those will be $200 to $250 probably. So that's a regret. I think I paid $150 for my Japanese PS2, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. I was super glad I was able to get another Japanese PS2, but with it scratching my discs like crazy, that is a big regret. So last big gaming purchase regret, I'm not really listing any games specifically. It's all hardware related, and Girl Geek knows all about this one because I vented to her about this many times. She's heard the whole story. but she could probably predict this one a mile away. But that is my Japanese PC Engine Duo that I currently have. That thing was a complete lemon. I bought it from Japan a few years ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago at this point. It had the box and everything. It was in pretty good shape, and it worked for about a day or two, and then it stopped reading CD discs. The cue card side was fine. I was able to play games just fine, but the CDs would refuse to spin. So that actually set me on track for a variety of different repairs. The same guy I bought my Marty from, for some odd reason, I still trusted him, and he offered to replace my Turbo Duo, or my PC Engine Duo, and you know, I sent it off to him. He did a cap kit on it and whatnot. Well, he also did an RGB mod on it. And while I didn't have to pay anything for these mods, all I had to do was just buy the kits and then send the unit to him, which, you know, I had to pay for shipping both ways. He did a pretty terrible job on both. It still wouldn't read games on CD, and the RGB mod didn't even work. It wasn't wired up properly for the cable that was sent with the mod. So the RGB didn't work, and the you know, the cap kit replacement also wasn't done properly, so the disk drive still wouldn't spin. I also ended up replacing the laser on my own, which still didn't fix it, and in the end I ended up sending it to basically a professional that has been doing this stuff for a very long time. He's well respected in the community as a TurboGrafx and PC Engine repair guy, and he cleaned things up, got everything working 100%, got the RGB mod working, didn't even charge me much for it, and basically told me everything the previous guy did wrong. So that's a big regret, having to deal with that. I mean, when you buy a PC Engine Duo or a Turbo Duo, these things are going to be defective in this day and age if they haven't already been fixed. The capacitors used are terrible. Most of them are probably leaking and non-functioning by now. Some of the lasers are going out. So, you know, this is something that you have to worry about when you get a PC Engine Duo. And I knew that existed. You know, when you pay a lot of money for a console from Japan, you know, you hope that it works, especially when in the listing it says it works. That was the first thing. And then when you send it to a friend that says he can fix it and he doesn't fix it, that's really frustrating. And then when you try to fix some of the things yourself and that doesn't work, that's extra frustrating. And then when you have to send it to yet another guy and pay more money for shipping, that's super extra frustrating. So that's a big regret, is this PC Engine Duo. You know, I wouldn't have as much regret with it if I just sent it to a professional at first, but you know, when a friend offers to do a mod and repair job for you, you kind of lean towards trusting him. But this guy, you know, has done some very generous things for me, and if you're out there listening, I apologize for this, but he's also done some things that ended up making my life a lot more difficult. And in the end, I'm the kind of person where, you know, if my life is made considerably more difficult, it's not worth it to me. And so that was this case. So, but yeah, on to the next question. Girl Geek asks, what was your biggest gaming purchase surprise? And for me, my biggest gaming purchase surprises, there are a few things. Let's start with some consoles of the 90s. So as far as consoles go, my biggest surprise was the 32X and the Jaguar. So the Jaguar was liquidated in the mid to late 90s for $30 a pop at whatever stores it was still available at, mainly KB Toys and various online retailers. $30. Keep in mind, Jaguars now, complete in box, go anywhere for $200 to $400, depending on if they're boxed or used or new. New ones actually go a lot more than $400. But yeah, $30. It was a system I did want back in the day, but you know, my parents wouldn't buy me one, and it wasn't until they were being liquidated for $30 I was able to, you know, talk my mom into buying me one. I would mow the grass for the whole summer or something like that, and so she got me the Jaguar. And then with my allowance money every other week, I'd go out and buy brand new Jaguar games. They were all about $10 a pop. So it ended up being a really fun system for the price. It's kind of a system that's really hard to recommend for the prices they go for today. But if you were there in the 90s and you were able to pick one up for $30 and then get all the great games for $10 a piece, it was totally worth it. It's fantastic. So likewise with the 32X, it was the same deal. I basically got one for $30 when they were being liquidated at Toys R Us. It came with Virtua Fighter, which was just an amazing pack-in. So that pretty much wowed me. Aside from Star Fox, on Super Nintendo, the 32X was my first experience with polygons. So Virtua Fighter just really wowed me on that. And so yeah, absolutely zero regrets on that. It was a very, very big surprise. And I ended up playing a hell of a lot of 32X over the next 4 or 5 years or so. It was really fun. Much like the Jaguar, it's kind of hard to justify today with the rising prices. If you have a flash cart, I think it's worth having a 32X, but if you don't, it's going to cost you a lot more to get into it than I think it's actually worth. Good thing with the 32X though, if you don't mind paying for the hardware, the best games are the most common games. So Doom, Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing, Space Harrier, Afterburner, Tempo, stuff like that. Those are relatively cheap games, so not very difficult to acquire. As far as actual game purchase surprises, a lot of budget stuff I bought really surprised me. You know, one of the earliest ones was, you know, a bunch of NES games. Like, I think I paid $10 for Astyanax on the NES back in the day when I was a kid. That was a ton of fun. My grandparents bought me a copy of Prince of Persia on Game Gear. I think that was only like 10 bucks, and it was a great port of the game. Really loved that. You know, a bunch of my own budget purchases later on ended up being some of my favorites, like Zoop, which was a puzzle game, which I still love going back to today. Iridian 2 on the Game Boy Advance, which was a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up, sequel to Iridian 3D, which was actually an on-rails behind-the-back shooter. Scorcher on the Sega Saturn. It was a $10 racing game. It was just amazing. Very, very difficult, but it's one of the most satisfying racing games for me still to this day, and I actually did a Let's Play on it not too long ago. But yeah, there are a whole lot of them, actually, that I ended up picking up really cheap over the years, and you know, I've always been a, you know, especially back in high school, I was very much a budget gamer, but it was easy to be a budget gamer back then and still buy high quality games because there was just so much out there on the market. Stuff would get knocked down to 10 bucks a pop eventually. That doesn't happen that much these days, actually, unless it's like a digital game. Alright, second to last question from Girl Geek is, in what game from a not so popular game console would you have liked to have seen remade? Either into a different console of the same era or the current console generation. Doesn't matter. So I'm going to mention a couple of games I already just mentioned. One is Zoop, the old classic puzzle game. I think it would be really cool if they brought this back as like a modern budget puzzle title, and then added some extra gameplay elements. Add a versus mode or a co-op mode or something like that, and you know, have more fleshed out modes with variations and whatnot. I've always thought Zoop was a great concept that just wasn't fleshed out enough. It's still one of my favorites from back then, as far as puzzle games are concerned. But even I could see that there was still a lot left on the table that they could have done. Scorcher is another one. I already mentioned that. It's a futuristic racing game. The Saturn, you know, the game was kind of held back by the hardware of the time. Even if it was on PlayStation, I don't think it would have been much better than it was on Saturn. Case in point, you know, PC was much more powerful, and the PC version of the game is just so much more playable because it runs at over twice the frame rate. It you know, is a lot more responsive with its controls, and it looks sharper and more crisp because it could go up to, you know, twice the resolution. So seeing that remade onto a later gen console could be cool. More tracks would be fantastic. It's got these really creative tracks and whatnot. But Kiss Psycho Circus, a game I recently streamed on my channel, is another game I'd just love to see. Sort of like a remaster of that in a similar vein to like, you know, like the Turok remasters. One reason is that it's a game that is difficult to get running on modern systems. It also crashes a lot, even if you can get it running on modern or older systems. And you know, it's got some gameplay elements that could be fixed. There are definitely some glitches that could be polished up to make the game better than it is. There's some better weapon balances and weapon tweaks could be made. Some quality of life changes like that could really improve the experience. I like the game a lot, but it's definitely not the most polished thing out there, and that's why I'd like to see it remade. So last question from Girl Geek is, what was your earliest gaming memory? For me, my earliest gaming memory was the Atari 2600. So the Atari VCS, or the Atari 2600 as it was later known. Yeah, really, lots of really great memories with that. My earliest gaming memories are from my original house that I was basically born into. We basically had this, you know, this 2-floor house, basically one main floor and then a basement, and my parents kept the Atari 2600 on a TV in the basement. And I remember them playing games like Missile Command and getting scared of the audio, and I'd hide behind the couch and things like that. Keep in mind, I was born in 1982, so this was the first couple of years I was alive. So scared of lots of things, and the sound effects of those games would freak me out. My parents do actually have a photo of me, very, very young, with a Pac-Man shirt on, holding an Atari 2600 joystick as just a baby. So it's like they got me in the video game direction right from birth, just about. And then, and then they played games for a few years. They stopped playing games by the time I got an NES when I was like 5 or 6 years old, which is a shame. But they did sort of get me in the right direction, thanks to having a 2600 and playing that and enjoying it. And my first gaming memories on my own, playing games on my own, was also with the 2600. When we moved to our main house that they still live in now, they hooked the 2600 up in my bedroom with my brother and I. And so we would actually wake up early before school and play that. We'd also play it on the weekends and whatnot. We'd borrow cartridges from neighbors. Yeah, those are my earliest gaming memories, the Atari 2600. That was pretty much it until the NES, but lots of fond memories over the 2600. All right, so last set of questions is from Sleeves of War. So thank you, Sleeves, and thank you, Girl Geek, for all those questions as well. So Sleeves asks, what are the most valuable or rare in the current market games you own physically? There are only a couple now. I used to own a lot of rare games that were worth a lot of money, but now, that list has dwindled quite a bit. The ones that are worth the most, which they still aren't worth that much in the grand scheme of things, maybe 200, maybe 250, but that's it. That's about, as expensive as my video games get, and I don't have many of those. But the one that's probably closer to 250 is Akamajo Dracula, the X68000 version. I bought that a year and a half ago as of doing this video. That's basically the X68000 version of the game. It's fully boxed and complete, disc, manual, all the documentation, stuff like that. It's in pretty good shape. Next up is Dracula X Rondo of Blood for the PC Engine CD or PC Engine Duo. I don't believe it has the spine card, so it's not worth as much as it could be. But that's $150 to $200, give or take. Yeah, so worth a decent amount, and it's a fantastic game, and it's one of those I saw at my local retail shop, and I happened to have a lot of credit on my account, so I went ahead and splurged on it, took a risk on it, and I'm glad I have it. So hopefully I don't get rid of it like I've gotten rid of most of my other games before. But as far as actual video games themselves, I'd say my various big box PC games are the games that are probably worth the most. Of the rest, I have that or my PS1 shmup library. So, I have a bunch of shmups for PS1 boxed and completes, and, a lot of them are the Japanese versions, so they're not worth nearly as much as they could be, but some of the US versions are, they're $50 plus games now, and even some of the Japanese ones will still cost you $50 and up. So, I don't have anything, I think, that's worth like $100 or up, on PS1 or whatnot. I'd say my most valuable games outside of, the two Castlevanias I mentioned are basically shoot 'em ups on, PS1, PS2, things like that. $50 ranges, nothing too special there. And the final question of this Q&A, actually, from Sleeves as well, is what is the part of your current collection, game or hardware-wise, that you're most proud of? And for me, I think I've answered this one before, but it is my boxed console hardware. So one thing I do when I buy consoles is I like having the boxes with them. For one, they look really cool. I like looking at the boxes. Also, there's a utility to them where if I need to move or put a console away, I can store them back in the boxes. So I try to make sure the boxes have like the styrofoam or the cardboard inserts or whatever, so I can basically put the systems back in their coffins, so to say, when I'm not using them. It doesn't happen much these days, but when I go and I move out, that will happen. So, but yeah, lots of boxed console hardware. I don't have as much as I used to. Like I had to get rid of a bunch of stuff, like my Apple Pippin and my Super CD-ROM attachment, my Super Graphics, my CDI, and a bunch of other stuff like that. But I do still have some stuff that I'm pretty proud of, like my Neo Geo CD, my Sega CD and 32X, and Genesis combo, Atari 7800, all the modern consoles I still have boxed and complete and whatnot, and the retro stuff in particular, Jaguar, that sucker has shot up in price, 3DO, Nintendo 64, you know, stuff like that. So yeah, very happy about that, and I want to keep growing on that, but money's been relatively tight lately. The money I had been splurging with has ended up going towards like hardware mods and stuff like that, not necessarily other consoles themselves, and money's getting to the point where it's quite tight again, so I won't be spending a lot on consoles, unfortunately. There are some other box consoles I'd like to get, like box Neo Geo AES. That's one. I'd like to get another CDI, you know, some other stuff like that. A boxed Atari 2600 I'd love to get, and preferably an original heavy sixer boxed, which has, you know, significant historical, well, significance. So, but yeah, that is pretty much it. That's gonna do it for this Q&A session. As usual, guys, you know, if you have any questions or comments, post them down below. If you're a Patreon backer, be sure to, you know, post more questions over on Patreon. Also, let me know if you're gonna just post questions on like random posts. Let me know if you'd like to put this towards a future Q&A video, or if you would just want me to answer the question then and there. Also, for everyone else, I do have a Discord section, or a section on my Discord server just for Q&As. Definitely go over there, drop questions in as you guys think of them. If I get enough questions, I just do these videos. So it's not like I do these on a monthly basis or a weekly basis. So whether I do these depends on whether I actually get questions from you guys. So if you guys want me to answer your questions, be sure to ask me questions. So, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I guess until the next one, take it easy.